Today we're going to be talking about solving quadratics by the quadratic formula. And so this right here is the quadratic formula. So it looks like this really crazy formula that we got happening here. So it's x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2 times a. Now this formula will be given to you, all right? So just keep that in mind. But remember that every single quadratic can be written in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, okay? So that's where these a, b, and c's that are in this formula come from, okay? It's just the number in front of the x squared for a, the number in front of the x that's b, and then the number that doesn't have any variable with it, the constant, is our c. So our steps are to find a, b, and c from the equation. We have to plug in the values and then we have to simplify. But before you can do any of that, it has to be equal to 0, okay? Your equation must be equal to 0 to find a, b, and c. So let's take a look at this first example. Okay, so we have 2x squared plus 5x minus 12 equals 0. So it equals 0. That means that this 2 here is our a value. Our b value is positive 5. And then negative 12 is our c value. All right, so we have x equals the opposite of b. So since b is a positive 5, that means that we are going to write negative 5 down. Plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, and that's all over 2 times a. So anytime I said a, I filled in a 2. Anytime I said a b, filled in a 5. Anytime I said c, I filled in a negative 12. So that's the second step, is to plug in those values. The third step is to simplify, okay? So the negative 5 is going to stay there. We got our plus or minus. We're going to have some number underneath that square root, and 2 times 2 is 4. So that square root is going to be the thing that takes the most amount of time to figure out what it is. So here we have 5 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 12. So this part here is 25. And then we have 4 times negative 4 times a negative 12. This is going to become a positive. So it's 48 times 2 is 96. And when we add those together, we get 121. So you don't necessarily have to do that by hand like I just did there. You could just type that part into a calculator and get your answer. Okay, the square root of 121 is a perfect square. So that means that that would give us negative 5 plus or minus 11, because the square root of 121 is 11. Okay, we now have 2 different cases that we are in. Just like we had before when we solved by completing the square, we got 2 cases. We have to deal with both positive and the negative. So we have x equals negative 5 plus 11 over 4, and x equals negative 5 minus 11 over 4. Now you can do these again in pieces, or you can type them in all at once. If you're doing it in pieces, then you're doing the numerator first and then the denominator. So negative 5 plus 11 is 6. Divided by 4 would simplify to be 3 halves, or you could say 1.5, 1 and 5 tenths. Okay. Over here, if we're doing this by hand, so in pieces, negative 5 minus 11 is negative 16. Divided by 4 means that this would be negative 4. Okay, so negative 4, and I'm going to circle both of these. You could put either one, it doesn't really matter. Now, if you're going to choose to type this into a calculator, you would need to do so like this. So we have to put the numerator piece in parentheses, and I'll show you that here. So if I'm typing this in, if I just try typing in negative 5, so negative 5 plus 11 divided by, do you see how that 11 is the only thing that's being divided by? So we have to put parentheses, negative 5 plus 11 divided by, now that 4 goes to everything, and that's where we get our 1 and 5 tenths. Or you can just have it as 3 halves. It doesn't matter. Okay, you could do the same thing where you just go back up here now and change that to be a minus sign, and then that's where it gives you the -4. Okay, either way is a valid method. All right, let's take a look at another one here. So if we have 3x squared minus 7x equals -5, so that question is not ready for us just to solve yet because we need to have it equal to 0. Okay, so we're going to add the 5 to both sides. Now, is that 5 like terms with anything we've got going on so far over there? Nope. So we're going to have 3x squared minus 7x plus 5 equals 0. So now we have A, B, and C. We're going to plug into that formula. So our formula says x equals the opposite of b. Since b is a -7, the opposite of that is a positive. Okay, so we have 7 plus or minus our b squared minus 4 times a times c, and that is all over 2 times a. All right, you could also, if you really wanted to, you could type it in like this into Desmos as long as you're doing the positive first and then the negative second. You can't put the plus and minus in at the same time and expect to get an answer. I'm highly suggesting that you're not doing that and that you're kind of taking it in pieces. So here we have 7 plus or minus. We're going to get some number underneath that radical, and then we have it over 6. Okay, so here, if I'll show you how you would do this. Again, you can do it by hand like we did before, or you can type it in. So you have to remember when you're plugging things in, I'm going to highly suggest that you're putting parentheses around things. Okay, so underneath that radical there, whoops, you can't see because of the glare, is -11. Now, if we take the square root of a negative number, is that allowed to happen? Okay, so this right here is a negative number. That right there is a negative number. If that happens, if you have the square root of a negative number, if we try and type that in here, so we want the square root of -11 is undefined. So that is something that cannot happen. And so that means that we have no real solutions. So there are solutions. They're what we call imaginary, which you will learn more about in Algebra 2. But for this question, if there's a negative number underneath the radical, we say no real solutions for our answer. Okay, so let's take a look at one more. We've seen a nice, easy, perfect square underneath that radical. We've seen a negative under that radical. Let's see what our next example is going to bring. So we have x squared plus 6x plus 1 equals 0. That means it's already ready for us to figure out a, b, and c. What number is here? So that's a 1. So a is 1, b is that 6, and c is that positive 1 there. All right, x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c. That fraction bar goes all the way over to the equal sign, 2 times a. All right, so now we're going to have x equals -6 plus or minus. We're going to come up with that number underneath the radical there. And 2 times 1 is just 2. All right, so here we have 36 minus 4. So here we have 32 underneath that radical. Now, 32, the square root of 32 is not a nice, easy number. 32 is not a perfect square. So I'm going to show you on this one how we're going to split it up, and we're going to just type in Desmos. So we either have x equals -6 plus the square root of 32 over 2, or we have x equals -6 minus the square root of 32 all over 2. Again, keeping in mind that when you're doing this, you need to put parentheses around the numerator. Okay, those are what we call implied parentheses to make sure that this works properly. Okay, so if we're here, we're going to type in the first Now you do need to push the right arrow here to get out of that square root before you push the other parenthesis, and then you divide by 2. So for these questions, we're going to round to the nearest hundredth. That means that we need to put 2 decimal places. So we're going to have negative 0. We have 171. Does that 1 round the 7 up? No, it doesn't. So we're going to say negative 0.17 or negative 17 hundredths. Okay, and that's a rounded answer, and that's okay. So then we're going to go back into this because the only thing that's changing is now on this side we have a negative square root of 6 minus the square root of 32. And so that means that here we would get an answer of negative 5.82. That 8 does round that up, so negative 5.83. Okay, so these would be our 2 answers. Okay, so if it is not a nice number there, my suggestion, plug it in. Okay, get your answers. So let's look at just some basic reminders. There's kind of three things to remember here, if you will. If the number under the radical is negative, the answer is no real solutions. Okay, you can't just say no solution, you have to say no real solution. If the number under the radical is not a perfect square, you can round your answer to the nearest hundredth. Again, that means 2 decimal places. And I just put again here how you're going to type those things in. This would be the steps that you would push, the buttons that you would push to get there, to make sure that you have both of your answers and that whole numerator is going to be divided by the denominator, not just part of it. And that's it.